In 1999, a biologist named Bruce Bogomil finished cataloging something that had been quietly documented for over a century and almost never discussed out loud: self-stimulating behavior in well over 1,000 species. Not occasionally, not as some bizarre outlier, as a normal, recorded part of behavioral biology across the animal kingdom. If your first reaction is to laugh, that's fine. It is genuinely a little funny, but it's also a strange thing for evolution to allow. Every minute an animal spends on a behavior with zero chance of producing offspring is a minute it isn't eating, isn't watching for predators, isn't doing anything that obviously helps it survive. So why does it happen anyway? Across so many unrelated species that they couldn't have learned it from each other? By the end of this video, I want to tell you about a troop of macaques that did something with this behavior researchers genuinely did not expect, something that suggests it isn't just a leftover biological glitch. But first, we need to ask why a behavior with no reproductive payoff would survive millions of years of evolution at all. This isn't a fringe finding from one strange study. It's documented across primates, marine mammals, birds, reptiles, and insects, dolphins using ocean currents and objects, deer using low branches, elephants using their own trunks, porcupines famously using their front paws with what researchers have described somewhat dryly as considerable care. This behavior shows up in males and females, in juveniles and adults, in wild populations with full access to mates, not just animals in captivity with no other option. That last detail matters more than it sounds like it should. For a long time, scientists assumed this was purely a captivity artifact, bored zoo animals with nothing else to do. Field researchers studying wild populations kept finding the same behavior anyway, in open habitat, with potential mates nearby, by choice. Which means, whatever is driving this, it isn't simply boredom or confinement. There are three leading explanations, and none of them require an animal to understand anything about pleasure the way a human would describe it. The first is called sperm competition theory. In several primate species, researchers studying mating systems have found that self-stimulation shortly before mating appears to clear out older, lower quality sperm, leaving a fresher batch ready when an actual mating opportunity arrives. Less a pleasure behavior, more a maintenance cycle. The second is the practice hypothesis, most often discussed in young, sexually inexperienced animals. The behavior appears to help develop coordination and physiological readiness well before an animal's first actual mating attempt, essentially a dry run for a system that needs to work correctly the first time it matters. The third is simpler, almost mundane. Tension regulation. In several species, researchers have documented this behavior spiking specifically during periods of social stress, overcrowding, dominance conflict, separation from a group. Not about reproduction at all, about managing a nervous system under pressure. None of these require the animal to consciously understand why it's doing what it's doing. The behavior persisted because across millions of years, animals that did it slightly outcompeted animals that didn't. That's all evolution requires. Here's where this stops being purely about individual biology, because in one species, this behavior does something almost nobody expected. Bonobos, one of our two closest living relatives, have been studied extensively by primatologists, including decades of field and sanctuary research associated with Frans de Waal. In bonobo society, self-stimulating and mutual genital contact behaviors aren't confined to mating contexts at all. They show up after conflicts, as a documented method of tension reduction between individuals who were just fighting. They show up during food sharing, apparently easing competitive tension over a contested resource. They show up as greeting behavior between bonobos who haven't seen each other in a while. In other words, in this specific species, the behavior has been repurposed by evolution into something closer to a social tool, a way of managing relationships, easing tension, and maintaining group cohesion, running on the exact same underlying biology that, in other species, never leaves the realm of individual physiology. Same behavior, repurposed entirely by social context. That's not something a simple reflex usually does. If the idea that evolution can take one basic biological behavior and repurpose it into an entirely different social function is the kind of thing that genuinely surprises you, that's exactly the kind of science this channel digs into every week. So go ahead and subscribe now, because next week's video does something very similar with a behavior you'd never expect to be social at all. Researchers studying a group of long-tailed macaques at a field site in Indonesia documented something that pushed this discussion further than expected. A subset of males in the troop were observed deliberately selecting and using small, smooth stones during self-stimulation, not randomly grabbing whatever was nearby, specifically choosing stones of a particular size and texture, sometimes carrying a preferred one between locations. A simple reflex doesn't have preferences about tools. A simple reflex doesn't remember which object worked better last time and go looking for it again. That's evidence of learning, of memory, of an animal making a small, deliberate choice about its own experience. None of this requires us to claim these animals are having a rich inner emotional experience identical to a human one. Nobody studying this is making that claim. What it does require us to admit is that this behavior across the animal kingdom is more deliberate, more variable, and more individually shaped than the word instinct usually implies. So, why does this happen at all? Not because evolution is sloppy, not because animals are bored, because a behavior that helps maintain reproductive readiness, or eases social tension, or simply regulates a stressed nervous system is a behavior worth keeping around, even when on any individual occasion it produces nothing measurable at all. The macaque with the preferred stone wasn't doing anything humans haven't done in our own way for exactly as long as we've existed. It just turns out that particular kind of self-maintenance is older than humans. Older than primates, probably. A quiet, mostly private piece of behavioral biology that nature apparently decided was worth keeping in one form or another across more than 1,000 separate branches of the evolutionary tree. Not a glitch, just maintenance